The Red River of the North has always been prone to flooding. Its narrow channel flows through an ancient glacial lake bed that is both wide and flat. It's also a river that flows contrary to a normal melting pattern, because the Red River flows north along the Minnesota-North Dakota border into Lake Winnipeg in Canada. Ice jams can back up the flow unless spring melting conditions are ideal, long stretches of semi-warm days followed by below freezing nights, allowing snow to melt gradually. And 12 major tributary rivers flow into the Red River, adding more complications as they melt. The winter of 1996 to 97 was one of the longest and harshest in history. By Christmas, the broad prairies of North Dakota and western Minnesota weathered 4 major blizzards. More than 100 inches of snow covered most of the region. On February 28, 1997, 2 weeks earlier than usual, the National Weather Service predicted record levels of flooding for towns along the Red River's 395-mile path, and towns began to prepare for the floods. Some 300,000 people live in the areas most prone to flooding. Tributaries and ditches were full to the banks with hard-packed snow, raising concern for breakout flows and overland flooding. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, St. Paul District, began aggressive flood control measures well in advance of the spring thaw. Dike building, which began in mid-March, was complicated by deep snowdrifts. In advance of the anticipated flooding, the St. Paul District Corps of Engineers awarded $4.9 million in engineering contracts to protect threatened communities, and sandbagging began in earnest.
The USGS gauge in town would have a reading of 18.5 feet. We're constructing to a level 20.5 feet. In this area here, that would be the equivalent of about a 10-foot high levee.
By late March, the snow began to melt. The river was beginning to rise. Flood predictions called for water levels above prior records. People were told to brace for the biggest flood of their lives. Water was already 6 feet over flood stage and rising at Breckenridge. Snow covering most of the Red River Basin contained 5 to 8 inches of water. In any given year, just 1.5 inches can cause flooding, depending upon how the spring melt progresses. This time, the worst-case scenario happened. Heavy rains fell on the headwaters of the basin, and a major blizzard dumped additional precipitation on a large part of the area. 50-mile-an-hour winds knocked out electrical power in an area 40 miles on each side of the Red River between Wahpeton and Canada. 1/6 of the entire state of North Dakota was without power. 900,000 cattle died in the storm, many frozen in their tracks. By midday, North Dakota Governor Ed Schaefer asked President Clinton to declare the state a disaster area. The disastrous weather was big news, and news media from throughout the country took up permanent residence, filing reports all along the flood region. The whole country was watching. As Breckenridge and its neighboring city across the river, Wahpeton, prepared for the crest, a storm brought 3 inches of additional water to the area in the form of snow, sleet, and rain. On April 6th, the river rose to 9.2 feet above flood stage by noon. In Breckenridge, the confluence of the Bois de Sioux and Otter Tail rivers created extreme backwater conditions on the Otter Tail, causing it to exceed all projected levels. Parts of northeast Breckenridge were flooded with dangerously cold water. 400 residents were evacuated. Then the temperature dropped, and the wind chill reached 25 degrees below zero. Snow and slush froze on the boulevards and roads, making them impassable and hampering the flood fight. Authorities closed Wahpeton businesses. By Saturday evening, Minnesota Governor Arne Carlson declared a state emergency and deployed 200 additional National Guard members to help fight the flood.
But as you fly over in the plain, the striking fact is the huge area that has been affected by this. And what's unprecedented is to have people out putting sandbags up to fight a flood in the midst of a driving blizzard. Now that really is unprecedented, and so as I said before, our response has to be unprecedented.
As conditions went from bad to worse, Vice President Al Gore, FEMA Director James Lee Witt, and Transportation Secretary Rodney Slater, and Director of Civil Works Major General Russell L. Furman toured the flood-stricken region with Colonel J.M. Wansik, who led the St. Paul District Emergency Flood Fighting Operations. The Red River kept on rising in Fargo. The crest was still to come. Already exhausted, dike walkers and sandbaggers worked around the clock. On Saturday, April 12th, the Red River exceeded the previous flood record at Fargo and was forecasted to reach 22.5 feet above flood stage on April 17th. Downriver in Grand Forks, dikes stood at 52 feet. But acceleration of the thaw and rising temperatures beginning on April 12th caused the National Weather Service to revise their crest forecasts daily. Between Monday, April 14th and late Friday, April 18th, the crest prediction for Grand Forks was raised from 49 to 54 feet. In Harwood, townspeople were prepared to hold back the water. The town of 600 faced flooding on 3 fronts, from the Red River on the east, the Cheyenne River on the west, and a drainage ditch to the south of the town. The St. Paul District Corps of Engineers helped create a 2-mile dike ranging from 4 to 10 feet high, which ringed the entire town, forming an island city.
We worked with them a little bit in the advanced measures planning for it, but they had everything essentially planned out, where the borrow areas would be, where we'd get the dirt, where the dikes would go. You know, many small towns, you go in and they say, well, you know, here, protect me, and you don't know where you are as far as elevations. Harwood came in and shot elevations. We knew where we were going with the material. We knew how high we had to go. It made it very easy for us to come in here and do this work.
Tuesday, April 15th, brought more trouble as the Red River continued to rise in Fargo. Unprecedented overland flows from the southeast struck Breckenridge's south side, sending 3 feet of water rushing into the area. Water was rising in all directions, and flood experts were predicting simultaneous crests along a 125-mile stretch on the Red River from Breckenridge to Grand Forks. The highest crest ever recorded occurred in Wahpeton, Breckenridge, Fargo, Grand Forks, and East Grand Forks. And still, all along the river, the water continued to rise. On April 17th, the Red River broke a 100-year flow record at Grand Forks. The U.S. Geological Survey reported flow rates of 112,000 cubic feet per second. The previous record of 85,000 cubic feet per second was set on April 10, 1897. Fast-flowing water was straining the dikes, which had held back the full force of the river for more than a week. Residents of the Lincoln Park neighborhood in Grand Forks voluntarily evacuated their homes because of water seepage through joints in the concrete flood walls, cracks in the tops of the clay levees, and through the sandbag closures. Sandbag closures are emergency temporary structures that tie the levees and flood walls to higher ground. Continued, unprecedented overland flows into the Red River of the North caused communities and the St. Paul District to redouble their efforts to stay ahead of the rising forecasts and the river. In Fargo, schools and colleges were closed. Police and fire officials went door to door, advising people to move to higher ground. A combination of the Cheyenne River breaking its banks and backwaters from the Red River flooded Interstate 29. Temperatures continued to climb, with the highs in the 50s and 60s. By 6 a.m., the Red River of the North at Grand Forks was at 51.6 feet, with a forecasted crest of 51.5 to 52 feet. Then, unprecedented stream velocities raised the flow measured to 136,900 cubic feet per second, a new record set on April 18, 1997. In East Grand Forks, city officials ordered all 9,000 residents to leave the city. Across the river in Grand Forks, every able-bodied person was sandbagging along the river, which continued to rise at a rate of 2 feet a day. Then, the protective works that had endured over a week of flood flows began to fail. At 2 p.m., an emergency sandbag levee failed at the point in East Grand Forks. In Grand Forks during the afternoon, closures at Lincoln Park, downtown, and Central Park began to fail. At 8 p.m., the sirens blared, and almost all of the town's 50,000 residents were told to evacuate. All the bridges were closed. At about 11:30 p.m., the sandbag closure failed at the Kennedy Bridge in East Grand Forks, inundating the downtown with floodwaters. In Grand Forks, the water treatment plant shut down, and the University of North Dakota released its students for the year. Despite the valiant efforts of the nation's most experienced flood fighters, in Grand Forks and East Grand Forks, the fight was over, and the river had won. The Red River of the North eventually reached a height of 54.2 feet above flood stage. But the worst was yet to come. On Saturday afternoon, one day after the city was evacuated, fire broke out in the Security Trust building in downtown Grand Forks, sweeping through a whole city block. The raging inferno destroyed 11 buildings, including the newsroom of the Grand Forks Herald and all of its files dating back to 1879. Grand Forks had literally been hit with hell and high water. 75% of the city was underwater, 9 square miles. 750 patients were evacuated from United Hospital and sent to hospitals as far away as Bismarck and Minneapolis. The Red River was now so high that it couldn't be crossed along a 200-mile stretch. The only bridges open between Minnesota and North Dakota were near the Canadian border at Pembina and St. Vincent, and at Fargo-Moorhead. To the north, in Pembina and Drayton, evacuations began as projections for the crest reached 4 feet higher than expected. Drayton's 1,000 residents were evacuated from the town for their own safety. With guidance from the Corps of Engineers, people throughout the region focused on fighting the flood. Plywood was used to raise the height of the levee by an extra 4 feet.
The people are fighting hard to save this community. I mean, they're working their hearts out to make this happen. It will be that same commitment, that same spirit that will rebuild the community if it gets floodwaters in it.
The Coast Guard patrolled the river by boat. Fortunately, the crest was lower than predicted, and the levee held fast. On April 22nd, President Bill Clinton visited the flood-stricken cities, touring by helicopter and visiting with evacuees sheltered at Grand Forks Air Force Base.
Finally, I'm directing our FEMA Director, James Lee Witt, to lead an interagency task force to develop and direct a long-term recovery plan for North Dakota, South Dakota, and Minnesota. We know that this is going to be a long-term effort.
By now, the Corps of Engineers had invested a total of $14.3 million to provide flood protection in the Red River Basin. More than 4.5 million sandbags and 220 pumps had been provided. The U.S. Coast Guard and National Guard were conducting search and rescue operations. Some 2 million acres of farmland was underwater, and 155,000 farm animals were dead from the floods in North Dakota alone. By the end of April, federal emergency management officials began to set up operations in the area. Finally, after more than a month of devastating floods, the waters began to recede. Almost every town along the Red River of the North saw the highest crests in recorded history. During the long siege, there were also many stories of victory over the floodwaters. Thousands of citizen volunteers, the St. Paul District Corps of Engineers, local and state governments and agencies worked together in a massive effort that held back the floodwaters and prevented or reduced flood losses in most of Fargo and in 31 other towns across the floodplain.
And we ordered some plywood, some 2x4s, and we got about 100 people, volunteers from the communities around, and we went around the whole project and we built a flood wall. And it's got to be known as the Great Wall of Drayton. So it's I guess a big day for celebration here. I think we're going to make it through this one.
Successful flood fighting measures prevented an estimated $233 million of damage in the Red River Basin. As those hit hardest by the flood of 1997 began the work of recovery and rebuilding, the St. Paul District immediately began recovery missions assigned by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, providing temporary water supplies for Grand Forks and East Grand Forks, removing 700,000 cubic yards of debris from Grand Forks, clearing storm and sanitary sewer systems, and constructing sites for almost 600 temporary housing units. But the St. Paul District Corps of Engineers work wasn't finished yet. The next project was to begin again, planning flood fighting strategies for the next year and beyond.